We have already learned how JavaScript can be used with an HTML form to develop a very nice calculation application. However, most forms are designed to accept input from the user and to take that input and send it to the web server for processing. So here we have an example of a form that allows the user to register for an account. If I were to click the register button without filling out any information, I will receive several messages. This is typically called form validation. So the object is to make sure that the form is filled out correctly before we send that information to the web server. So I can type in some information here, and notice everything is happening when we click the register button. So as the user slowly fills out the form correctly, and now we see a reply telling us that we have successfully registered for the account and we will receive an email shortly. The web server is doing some additional processing here with the information that has been sent. The HTML form has an action attribute. We did not need that on the calculation application. However, most forms use an action and a method attribute. The action attribute indicates the name of the script which will process the data. That script resides on the web server. The method indicates the manner in which the data will be sent to the web server. The method will be either post or get. The form very likely will also have an ID and a name attribute. The action of the form is called when the input type equals submit button is clicked. So we also have an input type equals reset button, which resets the form values to their original state. And we also have a generic input type equals button. Many developers use the input type equals button rather than input type equals submit when processing a form because it is much easier to work with. So in this form, we are using input type equals button, and we are calling a function. We are going through and validating the form, and at the end, if everything is okay, then we call the submit method. The submit method will call the action of the form, and the name value pairs, the data will be sent to the web server. So here we see the form tag that is being used in this application. We see we have an HTML file for the action because this is just a demo form. And we have a method equals get. We also have a name and an ID. So when the user clicks on the button, the action is called, and you can see the action up here in the URL. That is the name of the file that we just saw. And after the question mark, these are the name value pairs. This is the data that's being sent. We have the name of the form element and the value the user put in. The name of the form element and the value. The name of the form element and the value. The reason we can see this is because we use method equals get. Should we have used method equals post, we would not see the results in the address bar because they would have been sent in the body of the message to the web server. When working with JavaScript forms, we need to understand how to access the values in order to check them. This is accomplished using the value property. So text boxes and the larger text area box, which is not shown here, will return empty if the user doesn't fill anything in. So that is the default value, which is essentially is an empty string. When working with a select element, which is the drop-down list, the first option is selected by default, so that value will be returned. So we have a value property that we can retrieve in a text box, a text area, and in a drop-down list. We also can retrieve a value property for a radio or checkbox only if they are checked. If they are not checked, they do not return a value. Radio buttons and checkboxes also have a checked property. That property will return true if they are checked and false if they are not checked. So this is a useful property for validating a group of radio buttons. Remember, a group of radio buttons must have the same name, but always have unique IDs. So let's take a look at text box validation. Here we have an example of a text box on the web page, and underneath is the HTML code for that text box. This is our email box. We have a label element. We have the name and the ID. In our JavaScript code, we first need to retrieve the value. And in this application, we are using the dollar function to return the object reference. So I can retrieve that ID and, using the value property, store the value in the variable email. The next thing I need to do is I need to check that. So here in my JavaScript code, I would have my if statement, and I'm looking to see if the value for the email text box is equal to nothing. If it is, I give the user an error message using the next element sibling.firstchild.nodeValue properties, and I also am checking with this true-false variable in order to determine when to send the data. In this application, we are clearing out the error message in the else. So text box validation is accomplished by retrieving the value and comparing the value to an empty string. Drop-down validation. Here we see a drop-down list that has 4 options. By default, the first option is always selected. And here we see the HTML for that drop-down list. Notice the value in that first option is set to nothing. We can retrieve the value using the value property and store that in our variable country. And now we can use our if statement to check to see if the value equals nothing. And it's very convenient to do that because we set that value to nothing in our first option tag. This is always a very good idea to do for a drop-down list if you need to validate that the user has indeed made a choice. Now we'll look at a checkbox validation. Checkboxes usually have unique names. In this application, we only have one checkbox. So here we see the HTML, and it has an ID, and the value is coded in. Now we are using the checked property to store that value in the variable. Remember, the checked property will return true or false. So now we are checking to see if that variable is true or is false. Essentially, if it is false, we want to give the user the error message. And if not, we use the else to clear out that error message. Finally, we will look at the radio validation. So here we see a group of 3 radios, and here is our HTML. We can see that they all have the same named contact, and they all have different IDs and different values. And again, we are using our if statement to check to see if one of the above 3 radio buttons are checked. Before we go into the if, notice that I also have a variable called radios. And what is being stored in that variable is an array of those 3 radio buttons. I am using getElementsByName, and the name is contact, because these 3 form elements all share the same name. So I am storing that array in the variable. In the if condition, I have 3 statements connected with ORs. So if the first one is checked, or the second one is checked, or the third one is checked, then we know everything is okay. Else, there is a problem, and we give the user an error message. In radios, because they all share the same name, it is only possible to have one checked at a time. The reason I created the array was so that I could easily display my error message after the last radio button. So I am using radios and in brackets 2, that's index position 2, which would be my third radio button, to access the next element sibling, which is the span .firstChild.node value, which is the text element inside the span, to clear out that error message if they are checked, else I will set the error message if one of them is not checked. So here we have the form in its entirety. There is our form tag with the action, and we have our method equals get. We have the name and ID. Usually in forms, the values for names and IDs are identical because they're both unique. The name is for the server. This identifies the object whose value is being sent. ID is for JavaScript and for CSS. So here we have our two text boxes. Here we have our drop-down list. And notice we have our span placeholders for the error messages, and they are all accessed using the next element sibling. Here we have our groups of radios, our single checkbox, our two buttons. We have 3 events set up. The process entries function processes the form. We also have a function to reset the values. And when the form loads, we give focus to the first text box. Here is our function to reset all the values. Here is our function to process entries. Notice we're using the use strict directive and our $ function so that we can easily return the ID object reference. We first store the values for the 2 text boxes into variables to make it easier to work with. We store the value for the drop-down list into a variable to make it easier to work with. We are using the checked property with our single checkbox and storing it in a variable, and we will eventually test to see if that returns true or false. And now we are checking our first text box, and then our second text box, and now our drop-down. Here is the test for our radios. Here is the test for our single checkbox. And now, if everything is valid, we use the submit method to submit the form. It calls the action of the form, and we see the HTML page as a result.